The house on Bedford Drive, where Charles Laughton resided during his golden years in Hollywood, has always been an architectural marvel. Nestled among manicured hedges and grand magnolias, the Tudor-style mansion radiated old-world charm. But in recent decades, its reputation has shifted. Visitors and subsequent homeowners recount unsettling experiences, most centered around the house's library Laughton sanctuary in life. The first documented incident occurred in the mid-1980s when the house was sold to a prominent screenwriter. While working late one evening, he heard a low, resonant voice reciting something unfamiliar. Initially dismissing it as his imagination, the writer was jolted when the voice grew louder, as if someone were standing just behind him. Turning abruptly, he found the room empty, but the faint scent of cigars lingered in the air. Over the years, similar accounts have emerged. A real estate agent showing the property reported feeling a distinct chill in the library, despite the warmth of the rest of the house. As she prepared to leave, a shadowy figure crossed the room, moving toward the towering bookshelves. She fled in terror, leaving the door ajar and the lights on. One particularly eerie tale comes from a couple who hosted a dinner party there in the early 2000s. As they gave their guests a tour of the home, they entered the library and found one of the books on the floor, open to a passage from Shakespeare's The Tempest. Strangely, no one had been in the room, and the book hadn't been removed from its shelf. Later that night, they heard muffled sound snippets of monologues, they claimed, as though rehearsals from another time were being relived within the walls. The most chilling account came from a contractor hired to renovate the library. While dismantling an old cabinet, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Turning, he saw a translucent figure in a tailored suit, resembling photos of Laughton from the 1940s. The figure was said to have looked directly at him before vanishing into the wall of books. The contractor left his tools behind and refused to return, citing the experience as too real to explain away. Some theorize that Laughton's spirit lingers because the library was his most cherished space. He was known for his love of literature and theater, spending hours immersed in plays and poems. Perhaps his passion for the arts tethered him to the home. Today, the house is privately owned, its current residents remaining silent on the rumors. But those who pass by claim that on quiet nights, you can hear faint murmurs through the windows. Some say it's the wind, but others insist it's Laughton, reciting lines from one of his beloved works, his voice echoing through the library as it did in life. The intrigue surrounding the house deepened when a historian researching Laughton's life requested access to the property. The owners hesitantly agreed, stipulating that he only visit during the day. The historian, Dr. Evelyn Marks, was particularly interested in the library, which she believed contained rare personal annotations in Laughton's books. On her second visit, as she catalogued the shelves, a peculiar thing happened. She noticed a faint indentation on the worn leather chair by the fireplace, as if someone had just risen from it. Moments later, a book toppled from a high shelf, landing open at her feet. It was a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, and the page displayed the poem that began, "When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes." Intrigued but unsettled, Dr. Marks photographed the scene, intending to analyze it later. As she adjusted the lighting in the room, she distinctly heard a single knock on the wood-paneled wall behind her. Startled, she turned, half expecting to see someone standing there. Instead, the wall seemed unremarkable, save for the faintest outline of a hidden door she hadn't noticed before. Dr. Marks approached cautiously, running her hand along the edges of the paneling. There was no visible handle or latch, but the grain of the wood felt unusually smooth in one section, as if it had been touched frequently. She pressed against it, and with a soft creak, the panel shifted inward to reveal a narrow passage lined with dust-covered books and old scripts. The air inside was colder, and there was a distinct sense of age, as though the space had remained untouched for decades. Among the stacks of papers, she found an envelope bearing Laughton's handwriting. It was addressed simply, "To whomever finds this." Her heart raced as she opened it, revealing a single sheet of stationery. The note began, "If you are reading this, then the house has revealed its secrets to you, as it once did to me. What lies within these walls is not merely history, but the soul of something greater. Before she could finish, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath clouded the air, and a low, resonant voice filled the space. It was unmistakably Laughton's, clear as a bell, yet disembodied. "You have found the beginning, but are you prepared for the rest?" The door behind her creaked shut, leaving her alone in the dimly lit passage, the faint scent of cigar smoke now overpowering. Dr. Marks clutched the letter tightly, her pulse racing as the voice faded into an unnerving silence. The hidden passage seemed to stretch farther than the dimensions of the house should have allowed. The faint glow of a single, antiquated lamp on a corner table was the only light source, casting elongated shadows that danced like restless phantoms. She hesitated, debating whether to step back into the library or venture further. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, yet something compelled her to move deeper into the passage. As she shuffled forward, the wooden floor beneath her creaked rhythmically, almost in step with her racing heartbeat. At the end of the corridor, she found a room, a modest space filled with relics. A cracked phonograph, old scripts with Laughton's signature scrawled across the covers, and photographs of him on set. But it was the item at the center of the room that held her attention. A grand desk with a leather-bound journal resting on its surface. Dr. Marks approached cautiously, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk. The journal's cover bore a monogram CL. When she opened it, she found sketches of what appeared to be the house's original blueprints, with annotations in the margins. One phrase, scrawled repeatedly across multiple pages, sent chills down her spine. "The house remembers. The house chooses." Before she could ponder its meaning, the phonograph crackled to life on its own, emitting a warped recording of Laughton's unmistakable voice reciting a passage from Macbeth. "The way to dusty death. Out. Out. Brief candle." Dr. Marks staggered backward, her breath hitching. Shadows began to coalesce in the room, taking on vague humanoid forms. They moved with purpose, circling her, their features obscured yet disturbingly familiar. One figure stopped before her, reaching out with what looked like an arm, though it flickered like static. And then the voice returned, low and commanding, resonating through the walls. "You are part of it now. Will you listen, or will you leave?" The journal's pages began flipping wildly, as if caught in an invisible wind. Words bled through the pages, forming new sentences in real time. "The door closes for those who turn back. The answers lie ahead." A sudden thud echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, followed by what sounded like muffled laughter, a deep, booming chuckle unmistakably reminiscent of Laughton's. Dr. Marks turned toward the sound, feeling an inexplicable pull. The passage now extended farther than it had when she first entered, with faint light flickering at its distant end. Her hands trembled, but her curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She stepped forward, leaving the journal behind, and as she did, the door behind her slammed shut. The air grew heavier, the walls seeming to close in, as a single thought clawed its way into her mind. What if the house isn't just remembering? What if it's alive? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The deeper Dr. Marks ventured into the passage, the more the air seemed to warp around her, distorting her perception of time and space. The light ahead flickered erratically, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched toward her like grasping hands. Each step forward felt like she was being drawn into something far older and far more powerful than she had anticipated. As she moved, the sounds of the house, the creaks, the groans, the distant murmurs grew louder, more intense. The temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath puffing out in front of her like a cloud of smoke. It was as though the house itself was exhaling, breathing in rhythm with her. The flickering light led her to a narrow doorway at the end of the passage. It was unlike any door in the house, unmarked and ancient, with intricate carvings of faces and eyes etched into the wood. They seemed to watch her, their expressions shifting ever so slightly as she drew near. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, and when she touched it, the door swung open of its own accord. Beyond it lay a small, circular room, its walls lined with mirrors, dozens of them. Each mirror reflected not just her image, but something else. Faint, spectral figures hovering in the background, their faces half-formed, flickering in and out of existence. They were watching her, too. The air in the room was thick, vibrating with an energy that she could feel deep in her chest. In the center of the room was an ornate pedestal, atop which rested a small, intricately carved box. It seemed almost to glow, a faint light emanating from the cracks in its surface. Dr. Marks moved toward it, unable to resist. As her fingers brushed against the box, a sharp, cold jolt ran through her, and the mirrors began to ripple as though they were made of water. The figures in the background grew clearer, their features now fully visible. They were all people who had lived in the house before her. Some she recognized from old photographs, but others were unfamiliar faces, their eyes hollow and dark. They whispered in a language she couldn't understand, their voices a haunting chorus that seemed to echo from all directions. Suddenly, a loud crash from the hallway made her whip around, her heart pounding. The door she had entered through had slammed shut behind her. Panicking, she turned back to the pedestal, but the box was gone. In its place was a piece of old, yellowed parchment, scrawled with a single line in the same handwriting as the note she had found earlier. "You are the one who listens. The house has chosen you." Before she could process the words, the room plunged into complete darkness. The whispers grew louder, now distorted and frantic, as if the house itself was becoming agitated. She felt a presence behind her, cold and overwhelming, and a deep voice, impossibly close, whispered in her ear. "Now the game begins." The mirrors began to shake violently, their surfaces rippling like water, and the floor beneath her seemed to tremble as if the house was waking up, its ancient bones stirring. Desperately, she stumbled backward, her hands groping in the dark for any exit. The air thickened, pressing in on her chest as if the house was suffocating her, trapping her within its walls. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. But when Dr. Marks opened her eyes, she was no longer in the room with the mirrors. The walls were gone, replaced by a vast, empty space, an endless, echoing hall that stretched far beyond the limits of the house. In the distance, she saw a figure, barely discernible in the dim light. The figure was walking toward her, its form shifting, blurring with every step. Dr. Marks felt her heart race again. She knew, without a doubt, that it was Laughton. And this time he wasn't alone. The house had begun to show her what it truly was. And she realized, far too late, that she wasn't merely observing, it was testing her. As Dr. Marks stood frozen in the vast, empty hall, her senses overwhelmed, the figure slowly became clearer, yet more distorted at the same time. Laughton's silhouette loomed in the distance, but it wasn't just his form that she saw. The shadows around him twisted unnaturally, as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsating with dark energy. The closer the figure came, the more the atmosphere around her thickened, becoming heavy and suffocating. A strange, melodic hum echoed through the hall, as if an ancient instrument were being played, but the sound wasn't quite right, warped, like a record that was scratched beyond repair. It was both familiar and alien, a tune that seemed to reach deep into her subconscious, evoking feelings she couldn't place. It wasn't a melody, it was a call. The figure stepped closer, and Dr. Marks could now see the details. Laughton, or what she thought was Laughton, wore the same tailored suit he'd been photographed in during his prime. His face, however, was different. His features were soft at the edges, flickering like candlelight in a breeze. His eyes, hollow and unervingly dark, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. As he drew nearer, the shadows around him seemed to fracture, splitting into multiple shapes, each indistinguishable from the other. Some looked human, while others were not, grotesque, shifting figures that flickered in and out of existence. The air crackled with a low hum, and Dr. Marks could feel the presence of something far older than Laughton, something far darker, lurking just beneath the surface. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the deep, rich tone she had expected. It was layered, distorted, a mix of whispers and growls, reverberating around her like 1,000 voices. "You think you know the house's secrets, but it is not the house that chooses. It is the house that waits. The words sent a chill through her entire body, and before she could react, the floor beneath her feet began to shift. It was as though the hall was no longer solid, but a vast, living thing, its structure changing, warping as though the house itself were breathing beneath her. The walls stretched upward, and the once distant figure of Laughton seemed to multiply. His presence now surrounding her, blurring and twisting into something unrecognizable. The darkness crept closer, inch by inch, suffocating the light. The whispers around her intensified, building into a cacophony of voices, all calling her name. They were not just Laughton's voice anymore, but hundreds of voices, overlapping, each one pleading, warning, or laughing. The sound was deafening. Dr. Marks felt her knees buckle as the overwhelming pressure in the room threatened to crush her. The shadows began to coil around her like serpents, brushing against her skin with cold, insistent pressure. One by one, the figures in the hall stepped forward, each one wearing a face she had seen before: actors, writers, and artists who had lived in the house. Their expressions now contorted with a mix of fear and sorrow. They seemed to be trapped in this space, their forms flickering, caught in an eternal loop, and they reached out to her, their hands extending toward her as if begging for release. "Help us," one of the figures whispered, his voice barely audible over the clamor. "The house, it won't let us leave." Dr. Marks struggled to breathe, feeling the suffocating weight of the house pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to stretch and close in around her, the distorted faces of the former occupants warping and melting into one another, a single unified mass of desperate souls. The voices grew louder, their words now unintelligible, yet she could feel their desperation. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A faint light, far off in the distance, a break in the endless dark. It flickered once, twice, and then flared brighter, as if calling to her. It was coming from the door at the far end of the hall, the one that had been hidden from view when she first arrived. Without thinking, Dr. Marks stumbled toward it, her steps unsteady, but the house seemed to push back against her, as though it didn't want her to leave. The air thickened further, pulling at her, dragging her backward as if the very walls were alive, resisting her every move. But the light grew stronger, and the whispers grew fainter, almost pleading. She knew, somehow, that this was her only chance to escape, but as she drew closer to the door, the room behind her seemed to shift again. The shadows flickered, and the figures, those tortured, eternal souls, reached out with terrifying desperation. "Leave if you must," Laughton's distorted voice echoed, now laced with malice. "But remember, you are a part of it now. You always will be." Just as Dr. Marks reached for the door, a final figure stepped forward, its face obscured by shadows. It wasn't one of the previous souls. This one was different. Its eyes glowed with an eerie intensity, its smile unervingly wide. With a voice that sent a jolt of icy terror through her, it whispered, "You can leave, but you'll never be free." Before she could respond, the door swung open, revealing a blinding light. But as she stepped into it, the room around her collapsed, and she was consumed by the void. The light engulfed Dr. Marks, blinding her. But there was no pain, only a sensation of weightlessness, as if she was being pulled through the air, through time, through layers of space she could not comprehend. The whispers faded, the oppressive pressure lifted, and for a moment, she felt free and unexplainable peace. But when her eyes adjusted, she realized she was no longer in the hall, no longer in the house. The light had receded, and she stood at the threshold of a vast, empty landscape. The air was thin, cold, and the ground beneath her was cracked, barren like a forgotten world suspended between realities. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the faintest outlines of towering structures in the distance. Dr. Marks took a step forward, unsure of what had just happened. Her mind raced, still reeling from the horrors she had witnessed. Yet there was something eerily familiar about this place. She could sense it, like a tug at the edges of her consciousness. And then she saw it, the house. It stood in the distance, but not as it had before. The towering mansion, which had once seemed like a home, now appeared as a dark, twisted version of itself. The windows were shattered, the walls bent and warped, the very foundation cracked and sagging. It was no longer a place of refuge but a decaying monument, suspended in the air like a mausoleum. Dr. Marks stumbled toward it, her legs heavy, but the closer she got, the clearer it became. This was not merely the house. It was the house and something more, something ancient, something alive. It loomed over her, its presence suffocating. But there was an undeniable pull, a call that seemed to beckon her. When she reached the front door, she hesitated. The handle was cold beneath her touch, but when she turned it, the door creaked open with the same eerie familiarity. The once dark hallway greeted her, its shadows shifting, flickering as if to mock her return. There, standing at the end of the hall, was a figure, a man, but not quite Laughton, not quite anyone she had seen before. He was tall, dressed in tattered clothing, his face pale and drawn, yet there was something unsettlingly familiar about him. His eyes were dark, empty, but filled with a strange knowing. He smiled a sad, knowing smile as he stepped forward. "You're back," he said, his voice soft yet carrying the weight of 1,000 years. "And you understand now." Dr. Marks tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She recognized him now, not from the house, but from the stories she had read, the stories about the house's first inhabitant, the one who had built it, the one who had bound his soul to it. "The house," he continued, "is not a place. It is a prison, and it was never meant to hold only one." A terrible realization dawned on Dr. Marks. The house wasn't just waiting for someone to choose it. It had been waiting for her, for someone to complete the cycle, to feed its hunger. Those voices, those souls, they weren't trapped. They were the keepers, bound to the house for eternity, each one a part of its ever-growing consciousness. The man stepped closer, his eyes burning into hers. "You are the new guardian now," he whispered, his smile widening. "And you will never leave." The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash, and as she turned back, she realized she was no longer alone. The figures from the house, the tormented souls, surrounded her, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes pleading for release. But there was no release. Not anymore. Dr. Marks took one last look at the crumbling mansion before the darkness claimed her. The whispers returned, louder now, resonating with her very soul. She knew in that moment that the house had chosen her, and as its new keeper, she would be part of it forever. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.